Welcome back to the Warehouse Podcast. My name is Jesse. The Orioles are opening up part two of the 2025 Major League regular season. The All-Star break has come to a conclusion. The Orioles were only able to send Ryan O'Hearn as an Orioles representative to the All-Star game. He had a very uneventful All-Star game, going 0 for 2. And the Orioles, since this new uh the post All-Star break 2025 season for the Orioles has begun. The Orioles lost game 1 to the Tampa Bay Rays in blowout fashion, losing 11 to 1, and then the Orioles had a 2-1 lead. Dean Kramer gave a really good start heading into the 8th inning. Sir Dominguez came in to relieve him, ran into a lot of trouble, gave up 3 runs, and the lead ended up going back to the Rays, and the Rays ended up winning the game by a final of 4-3. So the Orioles, coming off the All-Star break, are starting 0-2. They lost 2 out of 3 to Miami right before the All-Star break. And more or less, I think it's fair to say at this point, I think we've seen enough from this team. And I have, for longer than this time period, have always sort of marked the Orioles as a non-contender and a non-playoff team for a while. For it's been a while now. I don't remember the exact date when I sort of made claims like this that the Orioles season was over. Tyler, I know, made episodes very clearly sort of declaring that this 2025 season was over for the Orioles. Um, and if there was any doubt, I think about it from the Orioles fan base, I think that the series against Miami and just how this series against the Rays has gone is evidence enough that this team is not making up really any ground in the win-loss column. They're still, I think now they're 11 games under 500. I'm not positive of that. I'd have to double check. But we've sort of been hovering around the same place for a while. Tony Mansolino has had a 500 record since he's taken over for Brandon Hyde. But the Orioles have just not been able to create the momentum that would be required in order to make any sort of serious, significant playoff push. At this point, the Orioles would have to rally off a 7 game winning streak, an 8 game winning streak. And anytime this season, there have been small moments and small glimpses. The Orioles, a few weeks ago, had a series against the Rays where I think they split a 4 game series in Tampa 2-2, somewhat encouraging after that point. Every time the Orioles have sort of built some sort of momentum shortly after, either a series or two after that, they've sort of got punched in the face and sort of been relegated back to frustration, or they've had a really rough game here and there. I forget exactly what had happened shortly before the Mets series started. Although the Orioles did end up winning the doubleheader and taking 2 out of 3 from that series, the Orioles coming into the Mets series seemed like they potentially had a little bit of momentum. Not saying that I believe that momentum was going to translate to a playoff berth for the Orioles, but the Orioles had sort of some momentum going into that series against the Mets. And then in game 1, we all know Brian Baker had that disastrous outing. And that's sort of what I mean. It's kind of been like that where the Orioles, when in the few times where they've put a few decent wins together, maybe against some pretty decent teams, just sort of tragedy has struck. There have been some really brutal games. I'm also thinking about the game to the Rays, where the Orioles were leading 8-0 and stuff like that. So there have been kind of moments, and I think just from what we've been looking at with the trajectory of this team, I think that I've sort of already declared it before that the Orioles were not making the playoffs, but I guess I want to have sort of little funeral or eulogy here for the 2025 season, just because I think it is even further confirmed at this point that this team will not be making a September appearance. With that said, I do want to, and since we did pass the All-Star break at this point, I do sort of want to talk a little bit about what I'm hoping for. I am going to keep watching the Orioles when I can, or at least when I'm able to. And I want to just talk a little bit about what I'm hoping for going forward for the rest and the remaining of this season. So the first thing, and sort of the most immediate thing for the Orioles to look at, really has to do mainly with not what's going on the field, but really the front office with this upcoming trade deadline. Now, I know Tyler did an episode sort of previewing it a little bit. We will probably continue to talk about this topic as the trade deadline approaches and as the Orioles continue to make trades. The Orioles have already made a move with Brian Baker. The Orioles will continue to try to make trades going forward. There are some obvious, I think most people that are watching or listening are aware of sort of the obvious trade chips that the Orioles have that are very likely to be traded by the end of the season. These are guys, of course, where their contract expires at the end of the season, and there's just no real reason at all for the Orioles to hold on to them. So, Ryan O'Hearn, Charlie Morton, those are sort of the main guys that you kind of look at as the primary trade chips that this team has. You can also look at Cedric Mullins. He has a contract that's also expiring. And then there are these obvious other sort of names that are also in the mix. Sagano is one of them. Eflin is another. Gregory Soto and Sir Anthony Dominguez. All of these guys, really, you can think about the entire bullpen potentially being a trade chip. I'm going to talk about Felix in a second, but all of these guys are sort of the obvious trade chips. And I think that it is really, really important this year for the Orioles to have a very, very active and robust trade deadline. I think it is really critical that the Orioles take advantage of. Obviously, the Orioles are in a really bad position from a baseball perspective, and sort of, I mean, we've talked about this is a team that has for the past couple years been on a downward trajectory, going from a 100-win team to a 90-win team to where we are at this year. So we're on this sort of downward trajectory, but it does open up with every there's sort of a political analogy that is similar to this, but that was, I think, famously quoted by Obama's chief of staff, but I think Rahm Emanuel's saying was, um, not that I have any love or not that I'm quoting Rahm Emanuel because I admire him to the contrary. But with that said, he always had this quote, never let a crisis go to waste. And I think that sort of encapsulates where the Orioles are at right now. The Orioles are in a crisis, they're in an identity crisis. They expected to have a much better team than we've had this year. Now, sort of because of how things have gone this year, everything, the entire plan, the entire mindset, the entire trajectory, the entire thought process for how to handle and be the GM for this team has to be altered and adjusted to the new circumstances and the reality of the situation that Mike Elias is observing on the ground or on the field. So I think that has to be clarified, and Michael Elias has to sort of, in his mind, clarify where the Orioles are at and figure out what is the path forward for this team. We've talked about, and it probably is in Michael Elias's interest to argue either both to David Rubenstein that this is a team that just needs to do a few things, clear some things up, and this will be a team that is ready to compete in 2026. I don't really necessarily agree with that, but that if that is the plan forward for this Orioles team, that will shape in large part what happens at this trade deadline. To what I was saying about the crisis that the Orioles are in presents opportunity. The Orioles, it wouldn't be a worse situation, but it would be a lot more difficult situation or a vague situation if the Orioles were hovering around 500 at this point or a little bit above 500 at this point. It would be very unclear about how to proceed, how to move forward, especially given the investment that went into creating this team, and the Orioles probably would be pushing to make a playoff push if it was realistically feasible, if the math could be justified, the Orioles and Michael Elias would probably be trying to find a way to make a playoff push, even if that was not exactly necessarily the right decision or the chances were relatively low of being able to make the playoffs due to having to leapfrog teams and whatever, because so much investment had been made into winning this year. Although in the offseason, of course, we've argued, given how they sort of dealt with the pitching, et cetera, there are, I guess, questions about what investments were made this year into the team winning. But overall, um, this was supposed to be a year the Orioles were supposed to have a really good season. And given if the Orioles were in a bit better of a position than they are right now, then it would be a lot more difficult, and the Orioles, I think, front office would be feeling the pressure to find a way to put their foot on the gas and find a way to make the playoffs. Given that the Orioles are in the crisis that they are in now, given that I think Michael Elias can reasonably assume there is no path forward for the Orioles to win the World Series or to make the playoffs this year. I think that makes things and his job a lot clearer, and he can go into this deadline as sellers at the deadline. So there, for one, uh, this is a little bit positive because the guys that have contracts expiring at the end of the year are the obvious trade chips. They're very clear. We know what we're doing with them. We don't have to gamble keeping Ryan O'Hearn and then just not getting anything for him by the end of the year, right? We don't have to take that chance or take that opportunity or take that risk, right? We can just know what we're doing and being like, okay, we're trading O'Hearn and we're going to do the best we can, getting whatever we can back for him, whatever talent uh, is available out there for him. So that is sort of, what I'm talking about a little bit with this crisis. There's opportunity for Mike Elias to bring sort of this team in a positive direction if things are done properly at the deadline. So basically, for this deadline, I really, really want it to be active. I want a lot of things to happen. I want there to be a lot of changes, significant changes for this team, for this organization. Their MLB trade rumors talked about how the Orioles are hearing offers on Felix Bautista. And I think somebody like him, absolutely, the Orioles should be exploring uh, possible trade possibilities for him. Despite I really do like Felix Bautista, I think he really is a great closer and a great pitcher. And I do feel relative to other relievers, like Brian Baker, for example, who the Orioles had just traded, somebody like Felix Bautista, I actually do think that the Orioles should be thinking about. I, the Orioles, I do think, should be thinking about him, despite I do feel more confident in Felix Bautista longer term or in the next few years performing well than I do most average relievers, right? And I sort of come to this conclusion because despite having a significant injury and being out for an extended period of time. He's really rebounded. I know the strikeout numbers are not exactly where they were when he was at his absolute best, and the walk rate is a bit higher as well. But overall, with that said, Felix Bautista, I feel he's been getting stronger too as the season has continued, and I've felt more confident with him. So I do feel like he is a lot less risky option than most bullpen arms are. With that said, though, he's excellent. I think he's going to draw a ton of interest around the league from teams that are trying to compete, and I think the Orioles really need to be entertaining offers potentially. I think some of this stems from the fact that at the end of the day, he is a bullpen arm. His value in the future is not even if he is really good, there are limitations on how valuable a closer can be, just given the limited number of innings that a closer pitches, etc. I think that if the Orioles do keep Bautista this trade deadline, even though he is signed through 2027, the Orioles need to compete and need to make a playoff push and make the playoffs next year in order to justify not keeping Felix Bautista, in order to justify not trading Felix Bautista at this upcoming trade deadline. Now, next deadline, he would still have a year and a half on his contract. So if the Orioles have a really rough first half, they can trade him at the deadline to a team trying to make a playoff push, and that team would have him, or a World Series push. That team would have him for the remainder of that year and 2027. So that would be a really that would still be he would still have a lot of value, but even still, he has 2.5 years left on his contract right now. Teams that are both thinking about competing the next few years and trying to make a playoff spot or a World Series spot this year are going to be interested in him and should be very interested in him. So the Orioles really need to, I think about and consider dealing away Felix Bautista. The only way that it would be okay to not trade Felix Bautista at the deadline would be for the Orioles to make the playoffs next season. It would not be worth keeping Felix Bautista if the Orioles are going to compete in 2027. That is too far away for the Orioles to contemplate keeping a bullpen arm that long. You're not going to keep even a fantastic closer like Felix Bautista. You're not going to keep a guy like that for 2.5 years, and 1.5 of the years you're getting there's no value to having him because the Orioles are not competing. And when you're leaving the possibility of bringing in some real serious prospects or position players or major league talent into the organization for Felix Bautista. So I really do think that I'm not saying that I'm going to be upset. I won't be upset if we don't trade him because I really like him. But even beyond that, I'm not going to be upset at Elias if we don't trade him. But I think if we don't trade him this offseason and then next year is sort of a repeat or something very similar to this year, and we've wasted a year and a half of Felix Bautista when we had a chance to trade him right now with maybe not his peak value, but very, very high value getting in return, then that would be really, really frustrating to hold on to him in a situation like that. I feel like the Orioles will end up holding on to him because I think Elias will sort of justify to himself, look, we're going to try to compete in 2026. If something goes wrong like it did this year, we'll trade him next deadline. But I'm not as sympathetic to that argument or that discussion. I think if we don't compete in 2026, then there's extra pressure for the Orioles to deal him now, basically, I don't know if Elias will think about it like that, and I think he'll probably find a way to not trade Bautista at this upcoming trade deadline. This actually, is not an episode about the deadline, even though I've already talked a bit about it. Um, I do want to just also add on this deadline topic. There are probably a couple guys that realistically are untouchable. Um, of course, I don't really, for the most part, think that anybody is ever really, really untouchable. The only time somebody maybe is somebody has really significant sentimental meaning to the fan base. They're a superstar, maybe someone like Manny Machado. I think could have been a guy that was an untouchable in the trade market, more or less. And then the Orioles made every effort to sign him. I'm not saying at the very last minute he was untouchable or making him untouchable at that point, but I'm saying early in his career or earlier in his career, I think there could have been efforts to make a long term contract. I can see there being arguments for guys like whoever, Shohei Otani or Ronald, maybe not even Otani, even though the Dodgers are nowhere in a situation where they would want or need to trade him. But, um, somebody like Ronald Acuna, who has been an all time Brave. I'm thinking about him because of this ridiculous throw from right field he had last night, which was incredible. So that's why he's on my mind a little bit. But Gunnar Henderson is potentially a guy like someone like that of that caliber that you want to make this guy because of the meaning to the fan base, because of the talent level, because of the production. They're going to be more or less untouchable, and you're going to sort of make every effort to, at the right time, extend them and keep them there for their career. It doesn't always happen like that, unfortunately. But all that to say, just I think almost everybody um, is more or less not untouchable, sort of in the way that I would more or less imagine it. Gunnar Henderson probably does, like I said, fit into that category of being untouchable at the deadline. Realistically, I think there are also a few other guys that, even if they're not untouchable, realistically, they won't be traded away. Who I'm really thinking about, of course, is Basayo. Just where the Orioles are at, they're going to keep him. There's no reason at this point to trade someone like Basayo, even though it wasn't that long ago. People had been contemplating trading guys like Basayo or Jackson Holiday. So I think Basayo is really an untouchable. And I would say that realistically, I'm sort of putting these guys in a bit different category. I think Jackson Holiday is not untouchable necessarily, but realistically, I think nobody is going to provide any sort of return that would justify the Orioles trading him. So I think he is, for all intents and purposes, Elias can kind of conceptualize him as untouchable going into the deadline. He's the reason I can just sort of briefly talk about the reason that he is more or less untouchable. No team would really, really want Jackson Holiday to make a playoff push. There are a few better second basemen or guys that can play second base out there that don't kind of have the contract, don't and wouldn't demand the value. Jackson Holiday is as valuable as he is, more because of the long term than he is at the current moment for a team potentially interested in making a playoff push. The Orioles have a long term need for a guy like Jackson Holiday. So I think realistically, just, it's more or less fair to assume Holiday is untouchable. I think Henderson, not Henderson, I already spoke about him. I think Westberg and Kauser are sort of in similar situations. Kauser, I wouldn't put in the same category as being untouchable or realistically quite as untouchable as Holiday, but he does have, he's not been playing well recently. I think it doesn't make a lot of sense for a team most of the time to acquire him for a playoff push because he does have all the years of team control. and Jordan Westberg is sort of in a similar situation to Cowser. They are just guys that are not going to be the first guys that are looked at for a playoff push and immediate urgency. They are sort of guys that you are looking, if they were to be traded, they're sort of guys you would want in the long-term picture, in the next 4 years or so, or 3 or 4 years or so for your team. They're not guys that you're going to go out and get because you want to win right now. So, I think it's more or less fair to assume that those guys won't be traded at the deadline. Everybody else, I think, more or less, I think I'm not missing anybody, but I think everybody else more or less is available. Of course, the entire bullpen is available. Guys like Kyle Bradish, of course, given just where he is injured right now. Grayson Rodriguez, they're not going to get dealt, but basically, most of the Orioles starting rotation is available. I think he hasn't been talked about a lot, but Dean Kramer has been pitching like really well recently. So I think he's a possible trade chip, but I think it gets a little more complicated with him. Um, yeah, for a variety of reasons, but I think there are guys that are more likely to go before him, and then if somebody like Morton were to go, if Eflin were to go, then you start trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to like maintain this rotation just through the rest of the season? So I think that's, somewhere where like Dean Kramer, it makes it a little more because there are obvious starting rotation trade chips on this team. I think it makes it more difficult to trade someone like Dean Kramer off this roster. But yeah, basically more or less, I think the entire starting rotation the Orioles should be thinking about at this upcoming trade deadline. But yes, we will continue to talk about and continue to talk about the trade deadline as we get closer to it. We might go into sort of specific players and stuff like that. So we will keep getting into it as it approaches. Obviously, it's sort of the hot topic right now just because the Orioles are where they are, and the Oriole fan base is going to be expecting a lot of things to happen and a lot of changes to happen at the deadline. The next thing that I really am hoping to see from this team is I would love for this team to play 500 baseball the rest of the way. There is a very good, given the trade deadline, there is a very good possibility that the Orioles are going to be a worse talented team going the rest of the way. It's as discussed earlier, on an earlier podcast. Since the Orioles have had Tony Mansolino, they've hovered a little bit above the 500 mark. Hopefully, that can continue even after the trade deadline. It might be difficult for the Orioles to kind of maintain that because there might be some instability a little bit. If Cedric Mullins gets traded and that sort of consistent center field piece, granted, Cowser will probably take over there for him, barring a center fielder coming back for him. Cowser will probably take over for him, so it's not tremendous instability, but there's also going to be instability with the lineup um if somebody like Ryan O'Hearn were to get traded. The rotation, of course, could take a big hit with Charlie Morton getting dealt potentially, and some of the other guys. So Eflin in particular. So I think that there is a very good chance this could be a worse team after the trade deadline. So it would be great to see this team play just 500 baseball the rest of the way. If the Orioles do sort of collapse a little bit and they sort of revert back to the Brandon Hyde sort of team that the Orioles had, or they play not 500 baseball but 450 baseball or something like that, I think it will sort of raise serious concerns to some extent about what are the prospects for this team in 2026. If the Orioles are the second half of this season, more or less will be the team that the Orioles have. Now, Grayson Rodriguez just had another setback, so it's a little unclear when he's going to be returning. But the second half of this team or the post All-Star break team will look theoretically similar to what the 2026 team will look like. And if the 2025 second half team really does poorly and doesn't do well, I think it will start to raise serious concerns for the Orioles about what is going to change this offseason that is going to turn this team all the way around. If this team ends up with in the 70 win range, which it's probably going to be in the low 70s, or in a really bad situation like the high 60s, right? Like that's where this team is at. And in order to turn around a team that had around 70 wins to put up another 15 to 20 wins in the win column for a team that is like that. That's going to be a big task for Mike Elias. Now, some of it they're going to be able to justify. Well, we didn't have Bradish all year. We didn't have Grayson Rodriguez. We're going to have them next year. And the other characters and guys that are not prevalent, right? But the second half of this team will be a lot of the same guys that are going to be on the 2026 team. And if the Orioles can't find a way to play at least 500 and then find a way to, in the offseason, make the necessary additions, if the Orioles really struggle in this second half, which I think is definitely within the realm of possibility, I think we could see a sub 500 team going forward the rest of the way. Um, I think it is going to raise sort of significant concerns about where this team stands in 2026. Now, I already sort of have said like I do not feel confident in 2026. I think there are some major flaws and problems in how this team was built, and I'm very concerned about how this team will rebound in 2026. And I think that there's just a lot of questions, and I think those questions are only going to increase if the Orioles play bad baseball the rest of the way. So I think it is really important for this team to at least play 500 baseball going forward, to at least that would establish some sort of pathway or some sort of stabilization that, okay, look, the first half was a disaster, but for however long it was, half the season or two-thirds of the season or whatever, this was a 500 baseball team that was given the injuries. We're also going to count for having Basayo in 2026. There are going to be some improvements. Maybe Kobe Mayo is going to be a little bit better than he was this year, etc. So, there are going to be some additions. Plus, we're going to go sign a couple guys in the offseason to fill in some holes, etc. After Dominguez and Soto are gone, we're going to try to find some ways to patch up and strengthen the bullpen, etc. Right? But I don't see. I just it's a hard time trying to say, oh yeah, we won 71 games this year, but everything is going to be a blank slate in 2026, and we're gonna win 94 games next year, right? Very infrequently does a team go from 71 wins to 94 wins. That doesn't happen much. So or 73 wins or 74 wins or whatever it turns out to be. That is a very difficult task. So I think it's really I think I would have serious reservations about creating a pathway to try to compete in 2026. But if that's the plan to compete in 2026, I think it's really critical the Orioles show that this is a competent baseball team, at least. This is a 500 baseball team. We're going to play 500 baseball or a little above 500 baseball the first half of next season, and then we're gonna whatever get some guys make a push for the second half or something to that effect. So but yeah, the Orioles really have to, I think, demonstrate in order to justify any of this, that this is like a competent baseball team at the major league level. And I think playing around the 500 mark is going to be really important the rest of the way for this team. And then the last thing I think that I would love to see, and that I'm hoping to see the second half, not to make this part extremely individualistic, but he has been talked about, and I think everybody is waiting for Basayo to be called up, Sam Basayo to be called up to the major league team. He, as it's been identified, as it's been pointed out, he is crushing it at AAA at the minor league level. He with the bat, I think he's more or less proven. There's nothing more he needs to do at the minor league level to make it to the majors. Now, I think, especially given the problems with the catching situation, I would love to see Basayo come up prior to being a September call up. I don't want it to wait that long because I think he's ready. I think it'd be nice to give him a more extended look and time in the major leagues than just a month. So I would really, really like to see Basayo come up, to see him play. It'd be great if he could get 100 at bats or something like that by the end of the season. That would be sort of ideal. For him, I think for the Orioles, in its entirety, um, he hopefully will end up playing every day. Whether he's catching every day is a different question, but somehow rotating in between whatever it is, first base, DH, catching, or probably mainly catching and DH. But it'd be nice to see him get his chance at the major leagues. Offensively, he's ready. And defensively, I mean, we know that he has some adjustments to make. But even the Orioles have kind of indicated that some of those adjustments, he doesn't need to be a perfectly adjusted and well-rounded catcher prior to coming up to the major leagues. I think it's more or less, there's learning that can be done about the catcher's position at the major league level. There's no reason I think he can't learn some of those things along the way. If this team was competing, maybe you would have a lot more reservations about not calling him up necessarily because it seems like the bat will be there. But you'd have a lot, and he would certainly be an upgrade if we were competing compared to the catchers that we're running out there right now. But yeah, but I think that given that the Orioles are not competing in this situation, it allows the Orioles to have an opportunity to put him in the catcher role exactly as much as they want to. They can put him there as much or as little as they want to. They can balance effectively his health concerns. Not that he has health concerns, but they can balance not overworking him behind the plate so early in his career. Even having him catching every day, of course, is grueling, right? And he's really, really young, and you don't want to overexert him unnecessarily. So the Orioles are in a fortunate position. We don't have to worry about wins and losses. We're in a fortunate position, let me clarify, from this one angle and perspective. The Orioles are in a fortunate position with this to be able to put him behind the plate as much or as little, or they're able to find the middle ground, the perfect middle ground between how much they want to play him behind the plate, and give him other roles. And if they want to put him at first base, there's an opportunity for them to do so. So, and then they can DH him whenever. Like the Orioles can revolve their lineup around where they want to put Basayo, and they can revolve their defense around where they want to put Basayo. So as far as revolving the defense around Basayo, potentially it would be useful for the Orioles to wait a little bit until Adley Rutschman returns. Gary Sanchez, it seems like, is going to return if he does return this season at the very end of the regular season. So he's sort of like not really a factor in all of this. But yeah, I think that it would make sense for Basayo to get called up to the major leagues once Adley comes off the IL. That way him and Adley can be the two catchers on the major league team. I don't think that the Orioles would want to do it before that, even though the Orioles are, throw running out two catchers who are much worse than Basayo right now. I think that you don't want to bring him into a sort of unstable situation. I wouldn't want it to be Basayo and Jacob Stallings on the team, for instance, right? So I would like to see Adley Rutschman return, but pretty quickly after that, I would like to see Basayo up, and I would love for it to not wait until the All-Star break in order for Basayo to make an appearance on this team. So those are really the main things I'm looking out for going forward for this team. Potentially, I mean, of course, there would be some other nice things to see. We would love to see Kobe Mayo, for instance, do a bit better. There are other guys, Holiday, for instance, keeping his offensive production more or less where it's been at for this season, not sort of falling off in the second half would be great to see. So there are other Cowser maybe turning it around and hitting a little better than he has been would be nice. So there are other nice things as well, but those are really my focuses. And those are what I'll sort of be thinking about and contemplating as I'm assessing how successful was at least just the second half of the year. Obviously, we know the entire 2025 season was a massive failure, and the project, at least for this season, has been a massive failure. But within that massive failure, that big massive failure, maybe we can draw some silver linings out of this second half that come forward for this team. So, anyway, thank you all so much for listening to the show. Hopefully, we are going to be covering the deadline in more specifics. I know I got into a lot of specifics. I always intend for it to be rather general, and then I do a little more specifics. I know I talked about some specifics in this discussion of the trade deadline, but hopefully even more specifically and more narrowly, we'll focus on some of the players, etc., as we continue to get closer to this trade deadline. Anyway, thank you all so much for listening. Please follow the show. Give us a 5-star rating and review. We have a YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Comment with any thoughts that you have on the episodes. If you want to get in touch with the show, please email us, thewarehousepod@gmail.com. Please follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at The Warehouse Pod. Thank you all so much for listening. This has been The Warehouse Podcast. My name is Jesse, and go O's.